Not too long ago, I had an article about the Linux Foundation. And I've talked about the Linux Foundation funding a fair bit, about how the Linux Foundation puts very little of its funding into actual Linux. In fact, they put more funding into blockchains and they're focusing on vaccine passports and just a wide variety of topics that just don't have anything to do with Linux at all. Like at best, you can be like, well, maybe you can run some of this on Linux, maybe. But they just don't put the funding into it. In fact, they run it. It's barely any of their war chest goes towards Linux. And then it came out that the Linux kernel, the maintainers of the Linux kernel, were going to be withdrawing long-term support for the Linux kernel. And what that means is they have this thing where specific blessed versions of the Linux kernel would be tested and supported for 6 years. Right? And this was used by a wide variety of different projects, Debian and many enterprises and many IoT makers and device manufacturers, embedded systems, all sorts of people were using these long-term support kernels. Not everyone and not every distro, but many. And but they were going to stop doing it because for a lot of reasons. They had a lot of reasons for stopping to do it. But what it really came down to, and was repeated numerous times, was that there just simply was not the time to do it. And it just didn't have a lot of bang for their buck, right? And so I made a comment that this seemed ridiculous to me, that the Linux Foundation wouldn't step in and pay this comparatively small amount to fund the continued maintenance of the long-term support of the Linux kernel, considering how much money the Linux Foundation has, just hundreds of millions of dollars coming in, and almost none of it's going towards Linux. So let's put some of it towards long-term support of the Linux kernel. It just seems like such an obvious thing to do to me. Well, Greg Crowe-Hartman got a hold of this. And Greg Crowe-Hartman is a Linux kernel maintainer. He maintains some of the stable Linux kernel branches, and he is an employee of the Linux Foundation. So he came out and rebuked me a bit. And this got picked up by Slashdot and a bunch of other media outlets as, oh my gosh, Linux kernel maintainer chastises Linux blogger Lunduke. And I just love it that all of them like to refer to me as a Linux blogger. That's fantastic. So I'm going to read this from Slashdot Media here. Greg Crowe-Hartman, Chastises critic, says Linux Foundation strongly supports Linux kernel developers. It all started when Linux blogger Brian Lunduke complained about how the Linux Foundation was reducing the 6-year long-term support window for the Linux kernel to 2 years. Lunduke argued that the Foundation seemed more interested in funding compliance best practices as well as artificial intelligence and blockchain projects. Well, that's not me arguing that. That's the Linux Foundation saying that. That's where they put their money. So that's not my argument. That's just what's happening. In an online discussion, Linux kernel maintainer Greg Crowe-Hartman had this response. And I tracked it down. And this online discussion was just a Reddit post. It was a post on some subreddit, which I am probably banned from because all Linuxy subreddits ban me eventually because they don't like me. I make a statement and then it becomes news and everyone's like, why does anyone listen to this Lunduke guy? And I'm like, well, apparently all y'all do. So cool. Anyway, I'm gonna read this response from Greg KH, who, by the way, I know we've broken bread before. We've talked plenty of times. I don't have anything bad to say about Greg, but I'm gonna read this. Did anyone think to actually ask the developer who is maintaining the long-term support kernel versions why he made that change? I.e., me? No, I guess that would take too much effort and wouldn't result in such a clickbait headline. Okay, to start with, Greg's right. I did not contact Greg. I could have contacted Greg, but I did not contact Greg. You know who I did contact? Several people at the Linux Foundation and got no response. You know how often I contact people at the Linux Foundation? Real often. You know how often I get responses from the Linux Foundation? The Linux Foundation, by and large, seems to have a policy where they simply don't respond to criticism. That's just the way it is. Now, maybe that's a good idea, maybe that's a bad idea, but it is the reality that which we live in. I've known many other journalists who have had critiques of the Linux Foundation, and they have had a hard time getting responses as well. I've asked Linux Foundation for comments on when I talk about their funding. I asked them for a comment before I publish the story. I ask them for a comment after I publish the story. I ask them for comments in private. I ask them for comments in public. I ask them for comments about this particular story too. I got none. Did Greg K.H. ever reach out to me in any way, shape, or form? No, not once. Did not try to. So is Greg K.H. being a little disingenuous here? Yes. Is he being a little high and mighty here in a completely undeserved way? Absolutely. Is Greg K.H. a bad guy? No, I don't think so. Not at all. Quote, LTS kernels are no longer supported for 6 years because it turns out no one used them. That doesn't have the same fun sound. That's his statement. Okay, so quote, LTS kernels are no longer supported for 6 years because it turns out no one used them, doesn't have that same fun sound. So he's saying here that nobody used long-term support kernels. Now, here's where he and I are going to diverge. Because yes, I did not reach out to Greg K.H. Should I have? Maybe. What I was really commenting on wasn't, because you'll notice in the article I wrote, I flat out said I kind of understood why the current Linux kernel maintaining crew was no longer going to be supporting the long-term support kernels. What I didn't understand was why the Linux Foundation wasn't putting more resources into making sure that it was possible to support long-term support kernels going forward. So I reached out to the Linux Foundation, which they had no response on. But that said, many Linux distributions ship with long-term support kernels. Many, including Debian. Many enterprises use it. Many big companies use it. Many device manufacturers and embedded systems designers use the long-term support kernels. This isn't a fringe side thing. It may not be the most commonly used kernel. Maybe people use more of the shorter term support, more recent kernels more regularly. But as a general rule, those long-term support kernels serve an extremely vital role in having stable API and ABI stable long-term supported kernels. It's critical. This piece on Slashdot continues. In a second comment, Croa Hartman also clarified that, in fact, quote, the amount of resources and other stuff that the Linux Foundation provides to the Linux kernel community has increased over the years, including last year. Just because new people are brought in with new projects that the Linux Foundation member companies want to host does not mean that somehow less is being given to the Linux kernel community at all. It is not a zero-sum game here at all. That's not how the Linux Foundation works in any way. Again, this would have been easy to verify if someone just asked us. So to repeat, no abandonment is happening here at all. The opposite is happening, just like it has for the entirety of the Linux Foundation's existence. Support has grown every year. Okay, so no. Oh my gosh. Okay, to start with, Greg K.H., again, he does good work. And when I met him, he was incredibly nice. He seems like a good dude. I have nothing bad to say about him. He's totally wrong here. But he is a Linux Foundation employee. He works for the Linux Foundation. He puts bread on his table because of the Linux Foundation. I expect him to defend the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation, year on year, spends less of its money, a smaller percentage of its money every year on Linux. It undeniably, what is it, 3% now? I'm excited to see what the next year is yet, because I'm expecting it to go even lower. But it's getting lower and lower every year. And we are seeing less and less projects about desktop Linux, about the Linux kernel from the Linux Foundation than ever. It's getting less and less. It just is. They're spending a lower percentage of their revenue on it, and they're doing less and less Linux projects. Now, many people were like, well, yeah, but look at all the projects. Linux is more than just a kernel. You got to have all the other parts of it. The other parts of Linux is not what the Linux Foundation does. The Linux Foundation has a huge number of sub-foundations, the majority of which are not pushing desktop Linux, mobile Linux, or even server-side Linux that the vast majority of people would even use. We're talking about stuff that is extremely niche-specific applications that could or could not be hosted on Linux, but don't have to be. Could be, in some cases, that are pushed by specific industries that specifically have an agenda and pay a huge amount of money to the Linux Foundation. They're not talking about GNOME here. You're not talking about desktop environments. You're not talking about laptop drivers. You're not talking about support for switches and routers. You're not talking about any of that stuff. You're not talking about the things. You're not talking about any of the userland stuff. You're not talking about any of it. Linux Foundation doesn't do that stuff. They do vaccine passports. They do blockchain technology. They're now in the artificial intelligence business. They push compliance best practices, renewable energy, green energy, a number of social justice causes. None of these are Linux. They're just not Linux. They're not the Linux kernel. They're not desktop Linux. They're not even server Linux. They're not Linux at all. And so to claim that otherwise, that the Linux Foundation is somehow really juicing up Linux, is false. Now, are they? Now, if you look at the total amount spent on Linux, has it increased year on year? Yes. Minutely. And almost not even keeping up with inflation. That's true. Go and take a look at the numbers. It's pretty bad. Yes, the numbers have gone up to coincide with inflations and the necessary raises to keep certain key people around. But otherwise, it's stayed pretty stagnant. And all at the same time, the Linux Foundation total income has ballooned, has been a mushroom cloud of exploding new income. So, is Greg Coe-Hartman right that I did not contact him? Yes. You know what, Greg? Next time I have a Linux Foundation story, I'm going to contact you. Just like I contact Jim Zemlin, the head of the Linux Foundation, the press department for the Linux Foundation, and so many others. And you can go ahead and decide if you're going to ignore me or respond. My guess is, if you run it up the flagpole, you'll be told not to. But that's just my guess. Is Greg Coe-Hartman right that the Linux Foundation spends more actual pennies right now than it did a year ago? Yes. Yes, that is correct. That is absolutely correct. Has it kept up with inflation? I'd have to crunch the numbers, but it doesn't look great. Has the percentage of Linux Foundation's spending on Linux compared to their actual total income decreased monumentally as if it were in a free fall? Oh yeah. Oh yeah, it has. Is the Linux Foundation funding long-term support kernels? No, they're not. Would seem like they would. Would seem like one of the few things they would do, in fact, considering the name of the foundation. And to wrap all this off, hold on a second. I'm reading over this thing real quick here. Okay, maybe that was the last. Maybe that was the last thing I wanted to talk about. Okay, that was the last thing I wanted to talk about. I wrapped it all off already. Yeah. So there you go, everybody. I have been chastised by Greg KH. He's wrong. But you know what? I'll accept it just the same. And next time, I will contact you, Greg. You can count on it. And with that, I do declare. Oh, wait. If you are not currently a subscriber over at lunduke.locals.com, go subscribe. Keep this thing afloat with no big tech, no algorithms, no ads, no trolls, no nothing. lunduke.locals.com, or you can get the triple pass for $95 for a whole year for all three sites, the nerdy entertainment, the technology, and the political stuff. Or you can just do $45 per year just for lunduke.locals.com, which is a good deal. It's like 9 months paid and then 3 months free. Sweet deal. Highly recommended. Gots to do it. Gots to keep it afloat. Gotta keep the independent journalism going, because who else is gonna get I almost said something naughty, is going to get chastised by Linux kernel maintainers and Linux Foundation employees. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I do declare end podcast.